Welcome to the Things As They Really Are podcast. In this episode, I will read an article I wrote some time ago on February 16th of 2015, titled, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? I wrote this article during a time of going through some circumstances which were caused by forces outside of me, and wondering why things would happen. And to be completely transparent, I was going through a divorce of sorts, and it was hard. Going through this, it caused me to really delve into the scriptures and try to figure out, to get a deeper answer of why things happen and why God lets things happen. So this is the answer I came up with. I hope it's meaningful to you as it was to me and still is to me. My post today focuses on an issue that every inquisitive soul thinks about. This problem has been put eloquently by many people. Quote, are all men's lives broken, tumultuous, agonized, and unromantic? Who knows? I don't know. Why can't people have what they want? The things were all there to content everybody, but everybody got the wrong thing. It's beyond me. It's all darkness. Close quote. Quote, can infinite wisdom and power make any excuse for the creation of failures? Is God responsible for all the wars that have been waged, for all the innocent blood that has been shed? Is he responsible for the centuries of slavery, for the backs that have been scarred with a lash, for the babes that have been sold from the breasts of mothers, for the families that have been separated and destroyed? Is this God responsible for religious persecution, for the Inquisition, for the thumb screw and rack, and for all the instruments of torture? Did this God allow the cruel and vile to destroy the brave and virtuous? Did he allow tyrants to shed the blood of patriots? Did he allow his enemies to torture and burn his friends? What is such God worth? Would a decent man, having the power to prevent it, allow his enemies to torture and burn his friends? Close quote. Quote, we cannot say that God would like to help, but cannot. God is omnipotent. We cannot say that he would help if he only knew. God is omniscient. We cannot say that he is not responsible for the wickedness of others. God creates those others. Indeed, an omnipotent, omniscient God must be an accessory before and during the fact to every human misdeed, as well as being responsible for every non-moral defect in the universe. Close quote. Quote, all of my life I have struggled to find the purpose of living. I have tried to answer three questions which always seem to be fundamental. The problem of eternity, the problem of human personality, and the problem of evil. I have failed. I have solved none of them, and I believe no one will. Close quote. In short, why does evil exist? Why does an infinitely benevolent God permit human suffering, agony, depression, and all things that could be considered evil or bad? The purpose of this post is to explain these things to the best of my ability. It is my opinion that the inability to answer this question satisfactorily to people will result in the loss of faith and the dismissal of faith for billions. I hope my explanation does not come off as the usual trite explanations we hear that neither edify nor make sense. I take full responsibility for what I have written, and this should not be interpreted as official doctrine for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The origin of evil. First, let us trace the origin of evil. The prophet Joseph Smith has succinctly said, quote, there are three independent principles, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of man, and the Spirit of the devil. Close quote. I personally interpret independent principles as meaning eternal principles. In other words, these three things, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of man, and the Spirit of the devil, exist independently from the other three. None of the other three created the other. It is axiomatic to see how the Spirit of God is independent and eternal principle, but the Spirit of man and the Spirit of the devil are not so obvious. Thankfully, we have some statements on the subject. Orson Pratt, an early apostle, taught that the origin of evil predates even the rebellion of the pre-earth life. Quote, I do not suppose that this was the first origin of evil. We do not consider that this creation on which we dwell was the first one that was made. We do not consider that the rebellion which took place in heaven prior to this creation was the first rebellion that ever existed. we do not consider that those beings who rebelled were the first ones that ever had their agency. But we believe that God has always been at work from all eternity, and that the creations which he has made are innumerable unto men." Close quote. Brigham Young spells it out plainly. Quote, "The principles of truth and goodness, and of eternal lives and the power of God are from eternity to eternity. The principle of falsehood and wickedness, the power of the devil and the power of death are also from eternity to eternity. These two powers have ever existed and will always exist in all the eternities that are yet to come." Close quote. Joseph Smith, speaking about the eternal nature of the spirit of man, quote, "The mind of man, the immortal spirit, where did it come from? All the learned men and doctors of divinity say that God created it in the beginning, but it is not so. I am going to tell you of things more noble. The mind, or the intelligence which man possesses, is co-eternal with God himself." Close quote. From this, I think we can safely speculate that the true nature of our mortal life is the intertwining of three independent forces. Two of those forces, the Spirit of God and the Spirit of the devil, seek to persuade the other independent force, the Spirit of man, to choose the blessings and lifestyle they have to offer. What implications does this have to our understanding of suffering and evil? First, we cannot charge God foolishly, because to blame him or to ask why is to naively misplace the blame and to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of existence. In short, quote, "God is neither the source nor the cause of either moral or natural evil." Close quote. The origin of the will. To understand this better, we can ask the question, okay, I can accept that God is not the creator of evil, but what does he not have power and control over it? Does not Satan exercise as much power as the Lord allows? Does this not make God a little guilty? This is a great question. The answer to this question is found in Doctrine and Covenants, section 93, verses 29 through 30. Quote, "Man was also in the beginning with God. Intelligence, or the light of truth, was not created or made, neither indeed can be. All truth is independent in that sphere in which God has placed it, to act for itself, as all intelligence also. Otherwise, there is no existence." In explanation, this verse is speaking of the co-eternal nature of man with God. Because it is co-eternal, in order for it to progress, there needs to be an environment where that intelligence can act for itself. This is where it gets interesting. If the intelligence is not put into a state of opposition, it cannot act for itself. It cannot be an agent. The consequence for such is stated as, quote, "Otherwise there is no existence." Close quote. Wow. In other words, there are eternal constraints upon our Father in heaven to provide an estate with opposition. It is not some willy-nilly constraint. It is something so expansive and so important that existence itself is predicated upon it. I do not pretend to understand this perfectly, but this does show that our Father in heaven is operating in eternal realities. Elder Neal A. Maxwell explains it well. Quote, "One distant day, brothers and sisters, it will even become more apparent than it is now, that given whatever constraints within which God began his work, so far as whatever each of us was way back of the beyond, and also given the agency and independency of man, our loving Father and God is doing all even he possibly can to help us." Close quote. In summation, our Father in heaven is not the creator of evil, and he cannot eradicate it with his omnipotence. Remember that people are independent entities with an eternal nature of reason and capacity to act. We are only made agents and have agency when that eternal nature is put in a position to be tugged by opposition. That truth, somehow in some way, is the fundamental law of existence. We can picture our Father in heaven in much better context now in Moses 7:28-30. He weeps over our mistakes. He groans in agony when evil plagues the lives of his children. When we understand the constraints even he is operating under, we can see the cause of weeping. All men are agents, but God will force no man to heaven. He will not force them, not because he chooses not to, but because he cannot. The consequence of force is too much. Bad things happen to good people because of the eternal nature of the cosmos. That is about as succinctly as I can put it. Others' choices affect us for the worst, but before we can blame God foolishly, before we desire to put a stop to their choices, we might want to remember the consequence for such a desire. Quote, otherwise, there is no existence. Close quote. This agency has been preserved unto us by the atonement of Christ, as it cushions the fall, so that we are literally suspended between the two opposing forces. Instead of becoming complete angels to a devil, Professor C. Terry Warner explains what implications this has on our explanations to those who are looking for answers. Quote, human agency was purchased with the price of Christ's suffering. This means that to those who blame God for allowing human suffering, Latter-day Saints can respond that suffering is less important than the gift of agency upon which everything else depends, and that none of us has paid a greater price for this gift than Christ. Close quote. In closing, I share a choice statement by Elder B.H. Roberts where he defines our true predicament. Quote, what is the value of this doctrine of the eternal existence of uncreated intelligences? He, the intelligence, has his choice of moving upward or downward in every estate he occupies, often defeating for a time at least the benevolent purposes of God respecting him through his own perverseness. He passes through dire experiences, suffers terribly, yet learns by what he suffers, so that his very suffering becomes a means to his improvement. He learns swiftly or slowly according to the inherent nature of him, obedience to law. He learns that which is governed by law is also preserved by law, and perfected and sanctified by the same. And that which breaketh law abideth not the law, but seeketh to become a law unto himself, and willeth to abide in sin, cannot be sanctified by law, neither by mercy, justice, nor judgment. Therefore they must remain filthy still. This conception of things relieves God of the responsibility for the nature and status of the intelligences in all stages of their development. Their inherent nature and the volition makes them primarily what they are, and this nature they may change slowly, perhaps, yet change it they may. God has put them in the way of changing it by enlarging their intelligence through a change of environment, through experiences. The only way God affects these self-existent beings is favorably. He creates not their inherent nature. He is not responsible for the use they make of their freedom, nor is he the author of their sufferings. When they fall into sin, that arises out of the volitions of law to which the intelligence subscribed, and must be endured until its lessons are learned. Close quote. Thank you for listening to this edition of the Things as They Really Are podcast. Stay tuned for new editions, more podcasts. Subscribe to my channel on YouTube, like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter, or visit my website and subscribe to my blog at thingsastheyreallyare.com. Thanks for listening.